A revolution is a struggle to the death between the past and the future. But while you can kill a revolutionary, you can never kill the revolution. Change is inevitable, and even the Gorosei know that they can only maintain an equilibrium. While the cycle often ends with the death of the past in order to birth the future, there are certain actors in history that carried a unique present into their tomorrows for a future they were never promised, only believing that one day it will eventually come. Those kinds of characters often hide in the shadows, but when they present themselves, the world starts spinning, and that's where we are at in the story right now. With organizations like SWORD that looks to change the structure of justice and the Revolutionary Army that wants to turn the world upside down, you gotta ask yourself, when did it start and what kind of storm are they bringing? And today I'm gonna expose the man behind the storm, the one character that connects all the dots, the past, present, and possibly the future. Oda's secret weapon that he hid for the last saga. And so if you're new to the channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. I think the best place to start is within SWORD. I think the ultimate question is, who's SWORD's leadership? Where did this revolution even start? Did it start at Ohara with Aokiji, or on God Valley with Garp? Was it Sengoku sometime later? And I think Oda is making it intentionally unclear, and at this point in time, it's hard to separate characters who just have knowledge of SWORD within the Marines versus characters who are supportive of it versus characters who are actually in it and can fit the current requirements. And while I do acknowledge the possibility that Kuzan in chapter 1080 may not be telling us the whole truth about SWORD for various reasons, I want to entertain the idea that some of it is true, but acknowledge that this description doesn't cover someone like Drake. He is a captain of SWORD but isn't publicly a Navy member. He would be an example of someone who is so deep in cover that he is a pirate that infiltrated a Yonko crew, which Aokiji's description dodged, which would have basically been self-incriminating if he were actually in SWORD. So Aokiji says that SWORD members are Navy that aren't Navy, but didn't add the notion of pirates that are Navy, which honestly wouldn't have been too far-fetched anyway, since the warlords are a thing that exist. And this would add another layer to SWORD and incorporate characters like X Drake, the popular Law being a SWORD member that Randy Troy has, and also Aokiji in his current situation. So what I'm assuming Kuzan did here is, rather than lie, he only told truths, just not the truth of the entire situation. And if I were to assume, there is a very likely assumption that can be extrapolated that admirals cannot be in SWORD. The reason I say that is I don't see how it could be feasible that a sitting admiral could be cut loose at any moment and the Navy could assume no responsibility for their actions of an admiral. Admirals still do need to wait for clearance, as we see in the case of Green Bull, who needed Fleet Admiral Kainu's permission, but honestly kind of reflected what Aokiji said here. Green Bull ignored his orders and tried to fight a Yonko without permission, but obviously in his case, his personality doesn't seem to line up with the people of SWORD. Characters like Fujitora though really make you wonder if no public current admirals are allowed in SWORD, but that's where what we said earlier comes into play, that there's probably characters that know of SWORD and support it from a distance. That might be Fujitora's role, but also Kizaru's in a weird way. We actually see that Kizaru demonstrated knowledge of SWORD back in chapter 509 with X Drake. He says Rear Admiral Drake. Oh, former Rear Admiral Drake. Are you here for some recon work on that? So he knows that Drake was in the Navy, left, and is working on something, acknowledging that Drake knows internal information on the pacifistas most likely, and saying his despair will be greater knowing what they are up against. Which is also an interesting note. It seems like Drake knows a lot more about Vegapunk than the average Navy member would, which the Vegapunk connection might be integral for a SWORD member, where if you remember, one of our first concrete data points of Vegapunk was from Kobe in Water 7 after Enies Lobby, where he tells us a few of Vegapunk's creations and innovations that position him as the world's greatest mind. But the overall point being that it seems like Kizaru and admirals in general are privy to this kind of information, which would explain how Aokiji knows this much, and it could still be that Aokiji is not in SWORD despite a lot of the points going towards it. Maybe Kuzan joined SWORD after he left the Navy, which I explained in my 1081 livestream and I'll elaborate in a future video, but the reason I'm reiterating that is because there are certain characters that could just not be in SWORD, as the Navy could never write them off. Admirals are definitely one in my opinion, but the other major one would be the legendary hero of the Marines, Garp. Yes, I know despite how chapter 1080 played out, I'm heavily leaning towards Garp not being a part of SWORD, and it's not even necessarily because of what happens in chapter 1080. I mean, it's kind of damning. According to Aokiji's description, Garp is a retired Navy, so basically he's off the books, is attacking a Yonko without permission, and shows up in the chapter where literally Sword is getting its introduction and ends the chapter in such a way that you almost forget that he coordinated the entire attack with Sword members. In fact, the two highlighted characters in Sword are literally Garp's proteges, and the man who explains Sword is Garp's first student. It almost makes too much sense that Garp is in fact a member of Sword, and even more, the leader. I mean, every other person in that chapter was Sword, so why are you even considering Garp is not in Sword? Well, there's a few reasons. I think the main reason is when you look at all of the shown members of Sword in this chapter, but primarily the two highlighted ones prior to all of this, Kobe and Drake, there is a sense of secrecy required. These guys are infiltrating and going undercover even amongst high-ranking Navy, it seems. They're keeping secrets that allow them to get into Kaido's orbit and commit crimes. And on the flip side, interact with Vegapunk and Seraphims and who knows what else with Kobe. I mean, Kobe had to have some kind of interesting interaction at Rocky Port, right? Law was the mastermind, Blackbeard is grateful for Kobe's help, and Kobe came out of that as a hero. So there is some intriguing mix of variables here that computes into a few scenarios, which I actually alluded to in one of my recent shorts, but I'll elaborate in a future video. But anyway, secrecy is incredibly important for Sword, it seems, and Garp is not secretive. I mean, sure, he was introduced in the cover story as a masked man, but in reality, he's a guy who can't keep a secret that his family members are related to the world's worst criminal. Seems like a blunder that would get Garp into incredibly hot waters if he were part of said organization. The coordination and spy-like nature of the job does not seem like something Garp could qualify for, despite his legendary resume. And now speaking of his resume, I think because of his epithet and accomplishments as literally a symbol of the Navy cannot afford to have Garp sully the overall image in a direct way, when ironically Garp kind of accomplishes that on his own. Which takes me to probably my favorite reason as to why Garp isn't in Sword, in that he doesn't need to be. If you take a step back, what would change if Garp were in Sword or not? Literally nothing. Could you ever see a world where Garp doesn't just enact his own sense of justice anyways? I mean, if you watched my Garp's Resolve analysis video, then you would know Garp has committed nothing but treason in the entire manga series. He let Captain Morgan go, let Dadan and others evade prison, he let Ace be born, he literally supports Luffy in his various criminal activities, and was pretty damn near close to acting on behalf of Ace at Marineford, and ultimately allowed himself to be taken down by Luffy, which allowed Luffy to set Ace free. But again, the overall point here is that Garp is a character that was specifically made to be stubbornly himself. I think the best way to think about it is look at how Luffy operates with the Grand Fleet and with Law. Law and the Grand Fleet try to put a label on their relationship, whereas Luffy has his own understanding of how friendship should be. And that's probably just like how Garp would operate. Whether Garp was in Sword or not, he would do the exact same thing. He doesn't care about labels in the first place, for himself at least. But at the same time, I think Garp is integral to Sword. I think in a lot of ways, whoever spearheaded Sword is probably doing it with Garp in mind, to carry on his justice, to execute on it in a more efficient manner. I mean, Kuzan notes how direct Garp is, and Sword is pretty direct when it comes to how it deals with pirates. And again, while Garp fits in a lot of ways, his proteges are in Sword, and he seems super familiar with Sword. But if we are talking about the literal perfect character to lead Sword, then we have to mention the man who draws almost no attention to himself like an actual spy. The character that was actually Garp's original design. Yes, we are talking about Bogard. Bogard is Garp's right hand for a minimum of 27 years. The man who fought with Garp against legends like Roger and Whitebeard. And the most significant thing is that Bogard was Garp's original character design, which is so important because that almost tells me that maybe originally Oda wanted Garp to be the leader of Sword, but later changed his mind and shifted that role to the OG Garp, Bogard. And I know some of you may not even know who that character is, might not remember that this character even exists, and I implore you to listen to the stream I had with Xavier Wolffan, the #1 Bogard content creator who has amassed over 100,000 followers on TikTok by speaking primarily about Bogard. But focusing back, hear me out on this, because I probably will address most of your questions by the end of this logic line. And if I don't, please add your questions in the comment section. So the leader of Sword is Bogart. The first really good detail going for him is that he is actually a swordsman. How crazy would it be if Sword didn't have a swordsman and it was led by a man who just punches things? But Bogart isn't just any swordsman. He actually is the first swordsman to ever use the iconic EI sword sheathing technique. You know, the one that Zoro uses against Mr. One and Kaido, but if that were the only reason, then obviously it wouldn't make too much sense. But in terms of a Navy member who could easily be written off by the Navy in a circumstance where they are involved in some kind of scandal, it's Bogart, the man hiding within the shadows of Garp, the legendary hero, the character that you forgot. He is literally designed as a private detective and is the character who actually trained Kobe and Helmeppo, who later became Sword members. And another important note is that Sword has its own hierarchy. It is a little confusing because of the dual ranks present, but it seems like Prince Cruz, who is a Marine Rear Admiral, has higher rank than all the other present Sword members. But if we follow that trend, that means above him is a Vice Admiral and an Admiral. And I think that pattern will exist. And with that, I think Bogart is an Admiral of Sword, which could easily make sense from a power perspective, which I'll get to in a little bit, but even more so from a pattern perspective. Yes, a pattern. One that is dead set locked in for the Admirals. It's no secret that the Admirals of our timeline, the new Admirals and even the Admiral candidates, were all based on prominent Japanese movie and TV actors who played a specific role in their respective movies that kind of reflect on the characters in One Piece. So for example, in Pardon My Pronunciation, Momo Usagi is based on Michio Kogure. Chatan is based on Kiyoshi Atsume. Aokiji is based on Yusaku Matsuda from Detective Story. Akainu is based on Bunta Sugawara, and the next three were all taken from the same movie, Ronin Gai. Kizaru is based on Kunie Tanaka. Fujitora is based on Shintaro Katsu, and this pattern is how One Piece creator Simply Kevin predicted Ryokugu to be based off of Yoshio Harada, and nearly everything about him down to how he would act. Simply Kevin said that Ryokugu would probably have wild justice, which is perfect considering his woods fruit brings out the wilderness. Green Bull acts like a wild rogue beast in a lot of ways and also has a wild sense of how civilization should be structured. And the thing is, I think that even for an admiral or admiral-like characters within other departments of the Navy, like the leader of the Bureau of Investigation, Tensei, whose name follows the naming thematic of the other admirals, but is most likely based on Akira Kobayashi from Battles Without Honor. And so while Bogart does not seem to have the similar naming scheme up front, he does follow the more important connection of being based off of a real-life actor in an old-time classic film, Casablanca. And so Bogart is based off of Humphrey Bogart, and you can see the literal one-to-one derivative, which would actually make him a very attractive candidate for someone at the admiral rank, considering the pattern that Oda has used here. But what is crazy is the role that Bogart plays in the movie. It makes him perfect for a Sword. The whole setting is great, and I will admit I did not watch Casablanca, which probably would have served as a great resource to further this notion, but let's maintain some sanity and just scrub through some Google searches. And we find that Bogart's character has a character arc that transitions to a self-sacrificing idealist who is tolerating the rising fascism during World War II, but ends up helping a resistance leader and helping direct refugees through his bar. And through some historical point, the movie has Bogart directing refugees with paperwork that allows them safe haven to Portugal, which would then allow them to reach the United States and Latin America thereafter. And that point, hold on to, because we'll come back to that much later in this video. So if you kind of consolidate this and make it relevant to One Piece, Bogart is a man who stays within a system and is operating on behalf of the oppressive forces that in a lot of ways does resemble World War II Germany. But if Bogart was in Sword, then it would mirror this note that Bogart would be working within the system in a way to help those who need safe haven from the oppressive forces. Which I'll go out on a limb and say that if Sword is eventually supposed to be embodied by Kobe, then yeah, Sword would be acting in a way to save anybody who is wronged regardless of who and what they are. And so these few connections led me to think that Bogart is a secret admiral that has rose to his rank underneath the massive shadow left by Garp. But you're probably sitting here thinking, in order to be an admiral level, you have to be strong. Is Bogart even strong? And for that, we do have to rely heavily on the narrative perspective here, and various parallels that shouldn't be discounted. But emphasizing this same narrative analysis is what allowed me to correctly predict the power levels of Shanks and Garp in the recent chapters. And so now, why is Bogard Admiral level? Well, I think we can all agree current Garp is definitely minimum Admiral level, and whether his old age is what ends up putting Kuzan over him is still really questionable, but it's irrefutable at this point that Garp literally has that dog in him. And what's even more, countless time Garp notes that in his prime he probably would have been way more impressive, maybe even 2 times more impressive, which is really wild, but during that entire time, there was a single person by his side. It wasn't Kuzan and it wasn't Kobe. It was a legendary right-hand man, Bogard. We see Bogard always a step behind Garp, and if Garp was clear of the Admiral level, then it wouldn't be surprising if Bogard himself is Admiral level, only inhibited by rank by wanting to stay underneath Garp and following his sense of justice rather than creating his own force like Smoker and enacting another sense of justice. I think Bogard is a character that benefits a lot from being underneath the maniac that is Garp. In a lot of ways, Garp is kind of that kid at school that gets in so much trouble that if you do something bad, no one will pay attention to it because of the louder troublemaker right next to you. And so we see Bogard with Garp in the current timeline, but also Bogard was shown in Chapter 0 with Garp, and it even looks like Bogard has maintained his youth from the past until today. And Chapter 0 was right before Roger's execution. And given Bogard's appearance here, I wouldn't be surprised if Bogard was with Garp at God Valley. Just like any good private detective, Oda has kept Bogard's age private from us, and a lot of things private from us when it comes to Bogard. But even if you don't want to accept Bogard being with Garp at God Valley, Chapter 0 makes it so that Bogard was with Garp when Garp was offered Admiral rank 27 years ago. So if you consider that Bogard has been Garp's right hand for 27 years, then you have to realize that there's no way a weakling would be by Garp's side for this long. Garp has endured the era of Rocks, the era of Roger, the golden age of pirates, the era of Whitebeard, and the current generation. If Bogard was with Garp through even a fraction of any of those eras, that leads us to the realization that Bogard is a monster in his own right. I mean, if it only took a few months for Kobe to land a hit on Luffy, and then in the 2-year time skip, Kobe is boxing torpedoes and Amazonian women, then I think it's safe to say Bogard, with the amount of time he had with Garp, is probably incredibly strong. I mean, what's even more important here is that Bogard is the one who trained Kobe and Helmeppo to become competent Marines that are powerful enough to survive sword. We already mentioned that Bogard seems to be a competent swordsman, but also Oda gave him a prominent looking sword. But another valuable point to make is the parallels around Bogard. He is a right hand. So while Kuzan would be considered a student to Garp, Bogard has never been in that position. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Bogard was above Kuzan before, and maybe they stayed relative to each other today. And the thing is, Bogard seems to be the type of character like Zoro to follow his captain regardless. Bogard seems like a loyal character that would rather be under Garp than anywhere else for some interesting reason that I hope we learn about. If we hold Garp as the Marine version of Roger and Whitebeard and we look at their right hands, they are not people we should scoff at. Whitebeard has more of a tragic story when it comes to that, and while Marco is the right hand, he can't be held to the same level as Rayleigh, for example. And I think Bogard and Garp would be more comparable to Rayleigh and Roger, the day one right hand that was by his captain's side longer than Rayleigh was with Roger. Bogard. And so if you look at chapter 1081, it's pretty evident that you don't become close to Garp unless you're capable of withstanding this kind of treatment. Again, if Kuzan and Kobe are considered students, then why would Bogard be weaker, especially when we know he is directly involved with training the future Marines? So now if you can see the logic for how Bogard can be an admiral and is strong enough to maintain that title, let's shift gears a moment to readdress something important. What is the purpose of sword? I mean, Kuzan only really told us what a sword member is and what they are capable of, but not what the organization's purpose is. From what we can gather though, is that sword members seem to be infiltrating groups that would be considered threats in the future and taking proactive measures by leaking intel. I doubt Drake would single-handedly take on Kaido in any regard, but he was letting the Navy know what was happening and reasonably understood that their hands were tied, especially since Wano wasn't an allied nation. So then it would make sense that every Yonko was assigned a sword member. If it were possible, impossible for them to infiltrate, then they would use any means necessary. But also significant people like Doflamingo had a sleeper agent in his own brother Corazon, which at this point would just make sense that Corazon was Sword. I mean, it could make sense that a Sword member, for example, might have been responsible for alerting the Navy about Shanks in the New World during Marineford when he was confronting Kaido. That couldn't have been Drake because he wasn't in Kaido's crew yet. So if there wasn't a mole in Kaido's crew, it could be that there was someone in Shanks' crew that notified the Marines, which I'll elaborate on a different video because that's not what we're here to talk about. See, this role that we are talking about that I just described actually is something we can confirm existing within the Blackbeard Pirates. Despite us discounting the possibility of Kuzan being in Sword, there definitely has to be some kind of leaker within the Blackbeard pirate crew, and we know this because of what happened in Baltigo with the Revolutionary Army. If you remember in chapter 803, after Dressrosa, we see Burgess alerting Lafitte and Shiryu that he is in an all-white place. He doesn't know the name or where it is, but it's somewhere nobody knew about, and he asks the crew to bring Blackbeard to attack this place because Dragon and the hateful Sabo are there, and it's the headquarters of the Revolutionary Army. And to give context of this situation, just prior in the same chapter, Dragon sent out a call to assemble all of the revolutionary leaders throughout the world to gather in Baltigo. So Dragon was unaware of the developing situation. But then we get an update in chapter 824, where the reaction at the start misleads us by questioning that the revolutionaries were defeated. But this is only because their headquarters was destroyed. But that's not actually what happened. Now, my headcanon has always been that Dragon could never fight Blackbeard in a fair fight on his home turf because the revolutionaries are protecting refugees and literally armies of children. Sabo and Koala are examples of the strongest versions of those kids, but for the most part, they're all literally non-combatants that Dragon has gathered. We see more examples of that from the people he saved in Grey Terminal, and so if Dragon had to protect all of those people versus Blackbeard, it would be such a handicap versus a man who has the power to destroy the planet and the darkness fruit. And the thing is, we know they didn't fight because the article reports no fatalities, but also we literally see that the revolutionaries and the leaders have no mention of any issues caused by Blackbeard. If anything, they came out perfectly fine, and I think that's a solid interpretation, but there's also something deeper if you read this carefully. So what was reported was that it says through an anonymous source the location of the army's headquarters was revealed. By the time the Navy and Cypher Pole arrived, the Blackbeard pirates had already leveled the settlement to the ground. But let's walk this back a little bit. Who is that anonymous source? If the Revolutionary Army had been a secret for decades and Blackbeard's crew was the only one who found out recently, naturally you'd think that the location of the Revolutionary Army headquarters was leaked by Blackbeard's crew, especially given the circumstances. You would think it was Kuzan who gave the world government a heads up, but there's one problem. Well, two. At the time, apparently Blackbeard didn't have full trust in Kuzan, but the main problem is they didn't have the location. They didn't have a name either. You're probably like, wait, what? Yeah, they only had Burgess's Viver card to follow, so unless the leaker provided the Viver card, then I'm not sure if this makes sense. No one on Blackbeard's crew could have known where the HQ was prior, so that means that the revolutionary location was leaked by someone else. And now finally we can take a few of these scattered pieces and put them all into one piece. If Sword's mode of operation is to insert members into organizations that threaten the balance of justice and can be wildcards in how the world government and Navy normally operates, then wouldn't it make sense that they put a mole into the organization of the world's worst criminal? The Revolutionary Army probably has a Sword member in there. Now, this is where there's a lot of options for how things could have went down, and I'm sure the comments will have a lot of varying angles, and I'd love to see them, but for this video, I'm going to paint the picture that I see most likely right now. I think that a Sword member is the one who leaked Baltigo's location to the world government and Navy, and now I know we would assume Sword members are sort of traitors, and so many people might be looking at Lindbergh for various reasons behind his naming, for example, but I think that's a different kind of traitor. Sword seems more like informants in a lot of ways, and when you take a step back, you have to realize two things happened here. Not only does it seem like the Navy was alerted, but the Revs were as well. The Revs suffered no losses, which, considering that they have to evacuate civilians and refugees too, means that they were alerted well in advance, and the article says that the Blackbeard pirates clashed with only Cypher Pole briefly. So if we assume that the Revs left before the Blackbeard pirates even got there, then that means that they were also told about the incoming Blackbeard pirates. Considering we see Dragon preparing to have everyone come to Baltigo just prior, it wouldn't make sense if they figured it out on their own. Then on top of that, Who stands to gain from the world government being informed? If Kuzan or a leaker from within the Blackbeard Pirates wanted the Revs safe for some reason, then they would have just leaked it to the Revs or through some mutual informant. Having Blackbeard clash with CP0 seems excessive, unless they want to prove something, which could be the case. But on the other hand, if the Revs headquarters was leaked and Blackbeard was an enemy they wanted to take care of, most likely because of the chaos they bring, then that alone could have been a reason to tip off CP0 or the Navy of the revolutionary headquarters, to have both sides essentially clash using their headquarters as bait. Calling and occupying CP0 would have been rewarding enough. And so with that line of logic, it makes more sense that someone on the Rev side leaked the intel, and it would make sense that through this mystery sword member that this information was passed through to the Navy and the world government. And now to address another thing. In order for all of this to work, there has to be both. Given the manga, someone on the Blackbeard Pirates leaked their intentions, and someone had to have told the Revs and leaked the headquarter location, because from what we know, the Blackbeard Pirates didn't actually know the location of Baltigo. They were just following the Viver card. But a sword member who infiltrated the Revs would know the location. So why would the sword member or leaker in the Blackbeard Pirates care about the Revs to even warn them in the first place? It's not like Sword would care that these criminal entities are taking each other out. It makes more sense that there is a leaker in the Blackbeard Pirates and a sword member in the Revs that created the ending scenario, working in junction whether directly or indirectly. And now let's put some names to the idea. Let's say that Kuzan was the leaker. I think he could have warned the other sword member, and if we play through some options, if Kuzan was a sword member, it could be that he was worried about the other sword member in the Revs, kind of like how Kobe and Drake had communications. But it doesn't even have to be like that. Kuzan could be in the Blackbeard Pirates and not be tied to any other entity and still warn the other undercover agent, especially if he has personal ties. I mean, we see him protect Smoker while not being in the Navy because it's a friend. We see him basically save Saul as an old friend. We see him go against Navy orders to save Robin. And most importantly, we see him protect Luffy as a favor to Garp. And who is the leader of the Revs? The family member of Garp's, Monkey D. Dragon? We clearly see that Kuzan still has emotional ties towards Garp, and Garp's family was threatened. So it could be that as a favor, he gave a warning out to an associate of his that could do with what they want with the information. And that's where we land on the best man for this mystery spot. Bogard. Yes, Bogard would have had close ties to Kuzan and maybe even trained him as well, since we see he's trained Garp's new favorite protege, Kobe. Bogard would be implicated here as the best person to contact about Kuzan's situation, but more than anything, Bogard would be the literal best person to be chosen as a sword member for Dragon, because he is Garp's right hand. If Dragon disagrees with Garp's sense of justice and created the Revs, Bogard, being the next closest person, would be the ideal person for the revolutionary to accept into their ranks. Bogard would be playing both sides in an interesting way. So I think the leader of Sword, Admiral Bogard, is going undercover with the Revolutionary Army. The Marines thinks he's watching the Revs, while the Revs think he is a true member of the Revolutionary Army. Whereas Bogard is truly on the side of the Revolutionary Army. Yes, the leader of Sword is allied with the Revs this entire time. It just makes too much sense. The Revs infiltrate oppressive kingdoms and Sword infiltrates oppressive pirate empires, both leaking out info and instigating what most reasonably would be the downfall of the respective infiltrated organizations. For one thing, we know that Garp has communications with Dragon. Garp came to Luffy knowing that Dragon was going to meet up with Luffy at Logtown. But is Garp handling the secret communication himself when he is out here blurting out his familial connections like this? No. It makes more sense that Bogard is facilitating this communication. Even the One Piece official website says that Bogard is supporting his stupid but strong leader. I think this works so many ways, especially because of the most important point that I've highlighted a lot, in that Garp doesn't seem at all worried about the Revolutionary Army. He hates pirates, he insults Shanks on the drop of a hat, he'll down-talk Luffy for being a pirate and call Ace a scallywag while looking him dead in the eyes while he is locked up on death row, yet for this dude that a lot of people don't even think is Garp's biological son, he doesn't have a single negative thing to say. Not a single time has he mentioned any disdain for Dragon or the Revolutionary Army. It would make sense if his trusted right-hand man was keeping tabs and was vetting out the Revolutionary Army. Through Bogard, Garp knows that Dragon isn't all that bad. And I think Dragon might willingly accept Bogard into his organization with open arms, because if you go back in time to Roger's execution, it seems like Bogard is older than Dragon and might have even played a role as Dragon's mentor while he was being raised. It's not like Garp had to don raise Dragon, it probably was Bogard. Bogard would have been able to alert the Revs to get out and fulfill his duties as a Marine to tactically leak Baltigo's location, instigating the fight that came after. If Kuzan was in Sword, then it would have been helpful to keep Kuzan's cover, but even if Kuzan wasn't in Sword, then Kuzan could have easily said something like, "I hope you repay my favor by keeping my affiliation a secret." It works either way, and one of the most important connections is I don't see Bogard keeping this from Garp. It could maybe explain why when Kuzan shows up in chapter 1081, Garp isn't surprised. Kobe is surprised, but Garp kind of just looks like he's accepting reality here. He sees his former protege and has a simple request. This kind of conversation makes way more sense if Garp knew that Kuzan was in Blackbeard's crew and simply was in disbelief until he saw it with his own eyes. And he does here. These faces from Garp gives me this sense of perspective. And so Bogard is a man of many secrets, but also a man that has many complicated allegiances. I mean, Bogard being connected and tied to the Revolutionary Army like this would explain so much. I mean, to be a Sword agent, you need to be a spy. To be in the Revolutionary Army, you'd have to be a super spy. And to be in both at the same time, you'd have to be the most low-key super spy in all of One Piece. And I mean, look at him. He really looks like the most spy-like character in all of One Piece. This would explain why Bogard has been nearly non-existent in the series. It's because he has to roleplay a double agent spy in one of the most turbulent times in One Piece history within two of the craziest organizations. It would make sense why he wouldn't always be near Garp. Bogard trained Kobe and Helmeppo, who later was confirmed to be Sword, and so if you think Garp has good synergy with the Sword team, well, Garp's right hand being their leader would make that make even more sense. And this theoretical role that Bogard plays ties back to the inspiration Oda had for Bogard in the movie Casablanca. See, the most interesting part of all of this is Oda said Luffy would have Brazilian heritage, and Brazil is a country that speaks Portuguese and was a Portuguese colony, and that is so interesting because he is from Goa Kingdom, and that name can be a connection to a Portuguese colony in India, and Dragon and Garp were born in Goa Kingdom, and so was Luffy. And so if Luffy has Brazilian heritage, then so does Garp and Dragon. And even if you want Dragon to be Rox's son, then what's crazy is Rox can be a reference to a famous Brazilian pirate whose name was Rox. And I said all of this ties back to Bogart, the movie character. Well, that character was aiding refugees escaping from World War II Germany to make it to Portugal, to make it to the West. And where do you think a lot of those refugees went to besides the US? Probably Brazil. So then this movie reference for Bogard would also tie in Dragon loosely, because in the movie, Bogart helped a resistance leader in Czechoslovakia escape via the same path. So if Bogard were helping the Revolutionary Army, he would also be helping refugees escape through a man who one way or another is connected to Portuguese heritage, which to me is one of the most craziest inserts to have in all of this theory. And you might think I'm done, but let me tell you right now, this theory is only at the Super Saiyan level. We ascended at some point, but I got 2 more levels to this. So let me hit you with the plot armor, the backup, and the future of the story by the end of this. I gotta say, you probably didn't think you'd be sitting through a 45-minute Bogard mega theory in 2023 from me. But here you are, and if you are enjoying your time, make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and share the vision so I can get more cool ideas out there. And so now here is the most important part. What's interesting about Bogard is his name. Oda could have just kept his name Bogart and left it to be a one-to-one connection to Humphrey Bogart, the actor, especially if this character was just going to be a purposeless, forgotten side character. But no, he changed his name to include a D, and we all know how important the D is. And you probably already see where I'm going with this. Bogard is a D-clan. Listen, hear me out. Why would he make that change? Maybe it's random, but no, it's not random. There's layer to this tiramisu. Garp is arguably one of the most important D-Clan members in all of One Piece, an old legendary D-Clan that fought the most influential D members, Roger, Rocks, and now potentially Blackbeard. He also grandfathered Luffy and Ace, and something that still stands is he is doing this underneath the world government that demonizes this clan, and yet he pushes Luffy and Ace to become Navy. Why? So they could be under him, right? If Dragon were in the Navy, wouldn't Garp want him to be underneath him for at least some period of time? I would imagine that if you were a D-Clan in the Navy, then you would gravitate towards Garp, or even more reasonably, Garp would probably take you under his wing. And what's interesting is Saul does seem to be connected to Garp. We know that Jaguar D Saul was friends of Kuzan, but look at what Saul did. He lived in the now. He lived by his own justice, something we see Garp influencing literally everyone he's with. I wouldn't be surprised if before Saul was a vice admiral, he was maybe mentored by Garp, which is why we see him clash with Sengoku, a man that always clashes with Garp. It would make so much sense that Garp would bring the D-Clan underneath his wing, and most likely his right-hand man is a D-Clan member as well. That connection to the D name would make him even more of an attractive addition to Dragon's endeavors, where it's almost odd that Dragon is the only D-Clan member in all of the Revolutionary Army, but even more so, if Bogard is a D-Clan member, then it also validates his leadership in Sword even more. Every single time we look at the people leading the world in change and the relative organizations pushing that change, it's a D-Clan member spearheading it. Luffy, Dragon, Garp, Roger, Rocks, and Sword's leadership being led by another D-Clan would make too much sense. And Garp already has his role within the Marines, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was where Bogard fits in. And the craziest part is I'm not just making this up. Bogard's role model, Humphrey Bogart, is actually Humphrey DeForest Bogart, which I thought was the wildest thing. The reason why is because remember, Bogart is Garp's original design, which means one way or another, Oda wanted to use this reference for Garp. The man I just said is probably the most pivotal D-Clan member in modern times. The only known D-Clan member to have interacted with all of the known D-Clan members is Garp. The only person who's an exception to that is Law, but I wouldn't be surprised if Garp met Law at some point, considering Law was a warlord. But back to the point, yes, Bogard's reference's middle name is D Forest, which may be incredibly important insight for what the D-Clan is overall, which is important considering Garp is a pilot character, a character that literally is one of the most important side characters in the entire series. But here is where my brain went to. If Bogard is an admiral of Sword, and Sword being an organization that runs counter to the main plans of the Navy, especially the sentiment of oppression, which so far it seems the prominent member Kobe, who will be the future of the Marines, doesn't embody, then it would make sense that eventually Bogard fights a Marine admiral. And if that's the case, then Bogard might end up fighting Admiral Ryokugu. If I am correct on Bogard, then behind his ideals would be the perfect man to counter the bigot bull Ryokugu. And my overall point being, one way or another, if Bogard comes into the story, then him being a D-Clan member is almost a given. But that brings up one of the final points that is actually a counter to what most people probably think of when they hear Bogard. Yeah, think about it. The first thing most average One Piece viewers would say if you asked them what they thought of Bogard would be, who? Even if you went to describe him, they'd say, oh, I completely forgot about him. And that sentiment is what most even hardcore viewers probably lean on. The fact that Oda probably forgot Bogard. But after everything I said about Bogard's inspiration, a movie character, of probably a movie that Oda used as inspiration for a portion of One Piece, that was the original design of Garp, that is the right-hand man of the legendary hero of the Marines, do you really think he forgot that kind of a character? No, I don't think so. And then you'd say, well, he hasn't shown up at all post time skip. Even when Garp is there, he isn't. Well, I explained story-wise why it would make sense if Bogard was the mega super spy. Why would you even be seeing him? Why would Oda even be showing the leader of Sword when he hasn't even told us what Sword is for yet? It makes me think of the way Mr. Zero was during the Alabasta arc. Oda loves playing with shadows, and Bogard is the perfect shadow, the man hiding in Garp's shadow. But then a really important question would be, well, Has this happened before? A character that plays this important of a role being so far gone in the series? Well, yeah, if you really think about it like this, Garp is the main character in Bogard's orbit of characters, so as the right hand, why would we ever get shine on him when Garp is there? He will always be overshadowed. That's par for the course. I'd go as far as saying that every right hand is basically set to the side compared to their captain, and none of their captains is the legendary hero of the Marines. For example, we barely got to know King's race. Katakuri got shown off because he fought Luffy. And who even was Doflamingo's right hand? Was it Diamante or Treble? I mean, I'm joking, but wait, going back to Whole Cake Island, Big Mom's right hand was kind of Strawson. And we didn't even get to see that in the story. Treble is Doflamingo's Strawson in that regard. And then we go back, Hody didn't really have a right hand, Crocodile has Mr. One, and this man barely says anything. Moria is a giant question mark. We just found out Beppo can do stuff, and we don't even know what Kid's right hand even looks like. The most notable right hands in the future will be Ben Beckman and Shiryu, and they will definitely be overshadowed by Shanks and Blackbeard. And that's where we land on Rayleigh. Rayleigh got highlighted because it was through him that we first learned about Roger. And I'm pointing all of this out so you can recognize that throughout the story, we barely got much Garp info, to the point that a lot of the community thought that Garp was a fraud until he galaxy impacted their headcanon into the Shadow Realm, or has them overdosing on copium. So if we got that little info on Garp, Bogard's captain, we weren't gonna get info on Bogard himself, which makes Bogard the ultimate spy character to insert in all of these places, the Revs and Sword. But okay, let's look at this another way. If we look at the characters adjacent to Garp, I think of Whitebeard and Roger immediately, and Whitebeard's right hand in orbital characters got introduced in chapter 233 and then a little bit more in 433, but Marco being Whitebeard's de facto right hand was also barely fleshed out. He did some things in Marineford, but if you sat there thinking he'd be important in Wano, you'd be lacking a lot of info until the Reverie arc. Marco only got fleshed out due to Whitebeard being a prominent figure in the Summit War. So when you think about it, Bogard would only be really shown or prominent when Garp is also highlighted, which is right now. If I'm right about everything else and about Bogard too, then after Sword's reveal, developing the revolutionaries a little bit more and giving us more about Garp would lead to when Bogard makes his ultimate debut. And I think this level of conversation covers why Bogard was an important character from a writing standpoint, along with the past of One Piece and why we never got him in the present. And I gave hints about what his role would be like in the future. Answering what it actually looks like is what brings us to the Super Saiyan 3 levels. I have a feeling the best way to explain this next part is on its own video, so I'll explain this idea as briefly as possible here and expand on it at a later time. So again, if you enjoyed this video and like this line of thinking, then consider supporting me through interacting with this video, or just check out more of my videos and leave comments there, or buy some of the merch on my website that many of you have already done, or join the Discord to be notified of any of my madness as fast as possible, because more than anything, we love having fun here, and thinking about possibilities and having an open mind is what we love to encourage here. Which takes me to the last part. I think Bogard could show up as early as Egghead, and I'll explain why in a second, but it might even be that Smoker and Bogard are working together. While we do get it softly confirmed that Tashigi is not in Sword, I did mention that just because someone isn't in Sword doesn't mean that they can't be an ally of the end goal. Considering Tashigi was shown on Full of Lead and Smoker wasn't shown in Egghead, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Smoker and Bogard were playing a very pivotal role here. And what role might you ask? Well, saving the Straw Hats. Emphasis on the Straw Hats and not Luffy. But to lay out the picture that I've been painting for a while now is that Shanks told us that Luffy and his relative pirates are saplings still, new shoots. And Oda has now proven that sentiment to be more than true in 1079 and 1080 through Garps and Shanks, and I feel like I cracked the code behind why that's the case. That there is a world of power difference between Luffy and Shanks still even after Onigashima. Go watch those videos if you don't understand what I mean, but the overall point is that there has to be a way for Luffy to level up to meet this stage, and the other Straw Hats in tandem as well. And the fastest way to level up is by getting a mentor, and I think that Bogard could be the perfect character to play the role of Luffy's next and final mentor, imparting the lessons that will bridge the power gap between Luffy and the likes of Shanks and Prime Garp. But not just Luffy. I think if this theory is correct, Bogard could be the best mentor for every Straw Hat that needs it. As a super spy, he would be multifaceted, but if he was the leader of Sword, then all of the versatility versatility in Sword is supported by him. And we know he trained Kobe and Helmeppo, and we can possibly extrapolate that to Kuzan and maybe even Dragon, but snipers and Devil Fruit users as well. So anything the Straw Hats need, he can cover, and he could even be Zoro's teacher that will help him get to the Mihawk level. Bogard demonstrated Japanese techniques, but also taught Helmeppo the unique sword style that even Zoro noted. According to Artur's world timeline, Kobe spent about 45 days with Bogard from when he left Luffy to Enies lobby. And so if Bogard could do this to Kobe in that short amount of time, imagine what he could do with our Straw Hats. Bogard being an Admiral level spy ends up solving so many questions. This role would also fit really well as a parallel to Roger, in that his right-hand man ended up teaching Luffy a lot about the pirating world and hockey. I think Bogard being Garp's right-hand man is the perfect person to teach Luffy about the other half of the world and the advanced forms and techniques of hockey. This would also make Egghead arc even more of a parallel to Sabaody in the events, tragedies, actors involved, and the aftermath, which makes it even more plausible to me. But also a significant issue for the Straw Hats that existed in Sabaody and still exists today is the reliability of the overall crew and not just the strongest three. So while Bogard can optimize Luffy, he can also optimize the entire crew like how Sword is. While the Straw Hats work together to a certain extent, imagine if they had the coordination that Sword had when Garp showed up to Full-Oled. Their combined impact would be amplified so much more, and what's even more amplified by this idea is the perfect narrative puzzle piece that would cover nearly every avenue of desired information. If this theory is correct, then Bogard could also teach the Straw Hats about the inner workings and provide information on the Marines, Sword, the Revolutionaries, the Reverie, Vegapunk if more is needed, Garp, Hockey, possibly God Valley, their allies, and he may even be helpful towards finding the Burn Scar Man, escaping Egghead, finding the One Piece, and most importantly, what danger lies ahead within Mare Joie, ultimately protecting the Straw Hats and acting as the last shield put in place by the old generation for the hopes of a new era. The gold generation left a lot behind, and while they might have passed before they saw the world that they dreamed for, they each ignited a torch to be carried to spark a revolution. And Bogard's might be the last torch to pass. So while the legends may be gone, their fires are not, because remember, a revolution is a struggle to the death between the past and the future. And while you can kill a revolutionary, you can never kill the revolution. And with that, I'll expand on that last part a lot more at a later time. But for now, thank you all for listening for this long. I want to note that it may be confusing between my long discussion videos and theories when it comes to what you're getting when you click on my videos. But the best way to know the difference is to get onto the Discord, because I'm able to notify you based on the subject matter. And I hope you enjoyed this random topic. I tried my best to rush out to get this video here in time, and I was so hyped ever since my stream with Xavier Wolfan. And so if you guys want to know how epic Bogard is, go check out Xavier Wolfan on TikTok and YouTube, because he is the expert that honestly put Bogard on my radar, because I too was once a Bogard doubter like the general population. But if you want to get enlightened and cultured, check out our stream together and his channel, because he makes primarily Bogard content and I love him for that. He makes some of the coolest connections, and I really hope you all thought this video was full of really plausible, meaningful, and unique connections. If you are a Bogard fan, make sure you share this around to get more people on the Bogard hype train. And maybe we will be loud enough for Oda to hear our dreams, because remember, a revolution is a struggle to the death between the past and the future. But while you can kill a revolutionary, you can never kill the revolution. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.